Nobody has more respect for women than I do. Nobody.
Hillary Clinton wants to abolish it, believe me. She wants to abolish our Second Amendment.
I think they didn't deny it. I don't think anybody denied it.
Other presidents did not call. They'd write letters, and some presidents didn't do anything.
Many people have come out and said I'm right.
You really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
Hello and welcome to Fallacious Trump, the podcast where we use the insane ramblings of King Ralph to explain logical fallacies. I'm your host, Jim.
And I'm your other host, Mark. A logical fallacy is an error in reasoning that results in bad or invalid arguments. And the logical fallacy we're looking at this week is the McNamara Fallacy, also known as the quantitative fallacy.
Yeah, so I think this is the only the second fallacy we've done which is named after someone.
Yeah.
Because we had the Gish Gallop
before.
Yeah. And this one, the McNamara Fallacy, is named after Robert McNamara,
right,
who was the US Secretary of Defense from 1961 to 1968.
Mm-hmm.
And he was previously an executive at Ford,
right,
and did very well for Ford in terms of kind of finding stuff that they could measuring
right.
it,
okay.
And fixing those things that they weren't doing as well.
Yeah.
He also saved a lot of people's lives by insisting that all Ford cars had seatbelts and things like that.
Yeah.
Which is good, prior to the government requiring it. But then he killed a lot more people because he was Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
During Vietnam.
Tried to measure that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, he tried to measure
that
that
motion
stuff.
Studies. Yeah. Lead to death.
So the McNamara fallacy is when people focus on something which can be measured at the expense of possibly the more important stuff. So you view the things that are easy to measure as important because you can measure them and you can kind of affect change.
Yeah.
But you kind of dismiss or look at as unimportant the stuff which is harder to measure.
Like qualitative stuff.
Yeah. Qualitative stuff.
Yeah.
So when McNamara was in Vietnam and they wanted to figure out how, if they were winning.
Right, yeah.
Basically what he did was said, well, we're going to just measure the number of Vietnamese we kill.
Yeah.
Ideally VC, but not necessarily.
Yeah, yes.
It did. Yeah. That bit didn't necessarily kind of go through to the troops on the ground, and what that resulted in basically was a culture of soldiers just killing all the Vietnamese people they could, and saying, yeah, they were Viet Cong, that's fine. And the higher the number of kills, the better for them in terms of like the praise that they got from their higher ups and and then it went up the line basically. Yeah. And so McNamara was saying, look, this is the Vietnamese body count versus the US body count. We're winning.
Yeah.
And that's not how that works.
No, which is why when you get the kind of personal accounts from soldiers on the ground that came back. I was reading one recently. No, there was a set of interviews on 16 Mil. Went over there at age 19, and came back, and it was his thing where he'd heard about all this amazing stuff that was going on. So when he got called up, he was kind of okay about that. Got there, it was completely different. They felt like they weren't winning ever. Because the ground that they would gain one day, they would lose plus some more the next. So, and yet the stories that they would be reading in the newspaper, sitting there in Vietnam, in the jungle, were saying they're doing marvellous stuff and we're winning. And he's looking around going, well, we're not. I don't know, what version of winning are they using? Well, obviously it's that one. So, yeah.
But, part of the reason that we're doing this one this week is because Donald Rumsfeld died. Yeah. He has gone into the great unknown.
Yeah. Yes.
And Rumsfeld was basically kind of as obsessed with figures as McNamara was as when he was Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
And that led to similar kinds of problems. Not the same problems necessarily, but just focusing on the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
This is from a book called Where Men Win Glory by John Krakauer. This is about the death of Pat Tillman, the former Arizona Cardinals player who was killed in a friendly fire incident. And that's what the whole book is about, basically, is the situation surrounding Tillman's death. what had happened is that Tillman's company had left in a couple of Humvees to cross an area which they wouldn't normally cross in daylight, but they had been told to. They'd been told that there was a deadline that they had to meet. And they were asked in the kind of ensuing investigation, why did you need to get there so quickly? Why did you need to leave during daylight, which had been kind of a rule against doing that, really? And Alpha Company First Sergeant Thomas Fuller, who testified under oath, saying, I think, basically, that headquarters just make these decisions. They just decide. They make a timeline, then we feel we have to stick to that timeline. There's no intel driving it, there's no events driving it, it's just a timeline, and we feel we have to stick with it. And that's what drives that kind of stuff.
Whoa.
Krakauer says, in other words, the sense of urgency attached to the mission came from little more than a bureaucratic fixation on meeting arbitrary deadlines, so missions could be checked off a list and tallied as accomplished. Yeah. This emphasis on quantification has always been a hallmark of the military, but it was carried to new heights of fatuity during Donald Rumsfeld's tenure at the Pentagon. Rumsfeld was obsessed with achieving positive metrics that could be wielded to demonstrate progress in the global war on terror, or the illusion thereof. So, yeah, we normally start with the Trump example, obviously. But Rumsfeld it seemed like that it was worth.
We ought to do that.
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting that it's saying it's always been a hallmark of the military, because I guess that's one of the things, isn't it, that you concentrate your troops on it. It's a bit like even the First World War, all the stuff, even down to Blackadder the Fourth, or goes forth, where they're not moving for months and months and months.
Yeah.
And they can
advance little further than an asthmatic ant carrying some heavy shopping.
Exactly, forever, and that's seen to be a failure. So so they would send the troops over the top in order to advance an inch or two at the loss of tens of thousands at the Somme, famously, with little or no gain. So otherwise, how do you measure war? It makes perfect sense that McNamara would work for Ford on time and motion stuff and then become head of defence. That's perfectly reasonable on that basis, that you would hire someone who's good at that stuff without and ignoring
without looking at whether those things that are going to be measured are the important things.
Yes,
that's the key,
exactly.
Really.
Yes.
And of course we do have Trump examples. Don't worry.
Yep.
And our first Trump example is from when he withdrew from the Paris Accord, basically, and these were part of his reasons. This is actually a couple of clips from the same speech, which were separated by some rambling nonsense that I've cut together.
Compliance with the terms of the Paris Accord and the onerous energy restrictions that is placed on the United States could cost America as much as 2.7 million lost jobs by 2025. The cost to the economy at this time would be close to $3 trillion in lost GDP and 6.5 million industrial jobs.
So, as we always do with Trump examples, we have to first pretend that's true.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, and also that he's seen it before and understands it.
Yeah.
Rather than he's just reading it with the emphasis.
Yeah. And then say, even if that was true.
Yeah.
What he's doing is focusing on the cost of trying to fix the climate.
Yeah.
And ignoring the much harder to measure benefits of not fucking the planet. Yeah. So what you can do is look at all of the things that reducing your CO2 would require you to do, and work out the cost of doing all those things, and then you can add those up and say, okay, this is the cost of it. It's much, much harder to say, people will have less health problems, people will, people on the coast will not be underwater. Yeah. There's lots of different wide-ranging things. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's so many wide-ranging benefits, including financial ones. Yeah. But they're a lot harder to quantify. A lot of them are qualitative, are just having a better quality of life, better environment and things like that. So it's much easier to focus on the measurable.
Yeah, and the importance is attached to the quantitative stuff because people are lobbying the government to say, well, you can't cut coal mining because we'll lose all these jobs.
Yeah,
So
but weirdly, businesses were lobbying the government to say, no, we want this.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
It's actually going to be good in the long term for business.
Yeah.
And in fact, these numbers that Trump gave, they did come from a study, but they were a wildly overestimated set of numbers.
Yeah.
The people who did the study looked at the almost the most expensive ways
Yeah.
of solving the problems
Yeah.
that they were
Yeah,
looking
of course
to
it did.
solve,
Yeah.
and said, look, this is how much it could possibly cost if we basically didn't do it efficiently at all.
Yeah.
If we just kind of threw stuff at the wall and hoped that it might bring CO2 down,
Yeah.
then it's going to cost a lot of money.
Or if we coated everything with diamonds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what they didn't do was look at any of the benefits, not just the qualitative benefits, but the financial benefits.
Yeah.
They didn't factor in the new jobs that come from
Yep.
investing in new energy technology and things like that. They didn't factor in the savings in households from having more efficient energy.
Yeah.
Cheaper energy essentially
Yeah.
by because it's all renewable and that kind of stuff.
Yep.
So by basically inflating the numbers, but saying because we can measure the money, that's what we should focus on. Trump got to say, this is way too expensive. We can't do it.
Yeah.
And ignore the benefits that are inherent in actually doing something.
Exactly. And it seems that people, one person in particular, a Swedish schoolgirl can kind of go, yeah, I can see right through what you're doing. And, can't you? We all know the benefits. That's the thing. We all know the benefits. And yet you insist on having to quantify the unquantifiable, or ignoring those people who are indeed quantifying the unquantifiable, because you're, literally supporting dinosaur industries, or appearing to. I mean, if Trump is ignoring all of those businesses, the new businesses that are saying, well, all those coal miners you lay off, we can take them on as solar panel installers. That's not a problem. We can take we need all these people. We could do that. So who is he appealing to? It's it's the kind of, probably the people who aren't in the energy business, but are just people who want America to stay like it has really never been, like it was supposedly in the 50s. Which it's the same with Boris. It's sort of Trump lives in this fantasy 1950s America that he was never in and never existed, and Boris does the same for England. It never existed, and he was never part of it because he's born in the 60s. He's a Beatles kid when it was all that, and so nothing like White Cliffs of Dover or any of that. That was old hat by the time he was born.
Yeah.
It's just he belongs to an education system, and Trump belongs to a business system which perpetuates that as the ideal time. And
the other thing, of course, that he's ignoring is not just the benefits that would come from being involved in the Paris Accord and helping climate change, but also he's not comparing it to the devastating and incredibly expensive results of not fixing the climate.
Yeah.
If you don't do the stuff, there's also an enormous cost based on that.
Yeah. All the stuff,
again, regardless.
Yeah.
Apart from the fact that we fuck the planet.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. all that cost of raking the forests. How many rakes do you need?
It's very expensive.
Very expensive rakes. You can't just have the cheap ones. You've got to have the ones that don't snap. And all that.
And when you're dealing with an existential crisis, basically, if it costs less than everything, it's probably worth it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yes, literally an existential crisis. Yes, absolutely.
So our second Trump example actually comes from Don Jr., the next generation of Fallacious Trump.
Yeah,
he tweeted about Syrian refugees, basically, kind of. Okay. He tweeted an image which says, if I had a bowl of Skittles and I told you just 3 would kill you, would you take a handful? That's our Syrian refugee problem.
Okay.
So aside from the
Mind
tortured
torturing metaphor, yeah.
what he's doing is saying how we should deal with immigration and refugees and things like that is we should look at the countable danger, essentially.
Yeah.
With, what is the risk that we're facing,
Yep.
as opposed to the qualitative benefit of taking in people and not just to the country but also to them, obviously.
Yep.
The fact that he's using a ridiculous number in claiming that 3 Skittles out of a bowl is the kind of equivalent number of Syrian refugees who are likely to kill you.
Yeah.
Philip Bump of the Washington Post did a quick kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation on what the real numbers are. He said that from 1975 to 2015, the annual chance that an American would be murdered in a terrorist attack carried out by a foreign-born terrorist was 1 in 3,609,709.
Wow.
That obviously doesn't even narrow it down just to refugees or even refugees from Syria.
Yes.
That's any foreign terrorist.
What's
so
the
basically,
proportion of vote? So it could be Canadians.
Well, what he worked out is you could fill 1.5 Olympic swimming pools with Skittles, and in there 3 of those Skittles would be poisoned.
Right.
So at that point, you're going, would you then take a handful of Skittles from that amount of Skittles?
You kind of
If there's also benefits to that, I mean, having Skittles is a benefit, obviously.
Yeah. So just like a fistful of those.
But if there's any other benefit, if your risk is basically kind of one, he worked out it's 1 in 3.64 billion.
Wow.
That having a Skittle from that swimming pool is going to cause you a problem. You could have 68.7 million handfuls before you're likely to get a poisoned Skittle.
Yeah.
Which, frankly, is too many Skittles, if anything.
Well, yeah. Is that possible? But yeah, I mean, it's a lifetime supply. Certainly, I don't know that there's ever too many Skittles. But I think if you're drowning,
I tell you, do you want to know what kind of lifetime supply that would be?
Yeah,
that is 330,000 calories a day for 130 years.
Wow, boy, you'd be fat. Jeepers creepers. Well, you'd have handy that it's in an Olympic swimming pool, because if you actually undertook to swim 10 strokes through the Skittles, and then only
at least you're burning off some of those calories.
Exactly, and only opened your mouth for one of those, you'd be fine. Yeah, it's a combination of lying with statistics and sleight of hand, doesn't it?
Basically, Don Jr. is taking the McNamara fallacy to another level by focusing only on something measurable and then horribly mismeasuring it.
Yeah, yes, exactly. But and it's all about the focus. It's all about the look at this. And isn't that horrible? And you go, well, yes, it is. Oh, my God, that is actually horrible. It's completely untrue. If it's anywhere near true, that would be awful. Yeah. So there's so much focus. You can ignore whether it's true or not. That's the beauty of this fallacy. But we've never talked about the benefit of fallacies before. That's what's happening when this fallacy is happening. You're being doubly duped. One, that you're being told to focus on this statistic, and in doing so, you're told to never mind about whether it's true or not. If this is true, it would be horrible. God, yeah, it would be. Yeah.
And this tweet also caused the people who make Skittles to tweet, "Skittles are not people."
Nice.
Which I think is useful information.
Yeah.
And also, it was it was taken down because the guy who took the stock photo of the Skittles, which we used, was a photographer actually from Guildford, where I grew up.
Oh, right.
And who is himself a refugee.
Wow.
And he said, no, this photo was used without my permission. That's not okay. And Twitter took it down. So
brilliant. That's brilliant, isn't it? That is the equivalent of catching Al Capone for tax evasion, isn't it? The only reason we took it down is because he's using the photo without permission, rather than being outrageously xenophobic by lying.
That's fine. It's Twitter.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, you're right there, yeah.
And now is the time, I think, for Mark's British politics corner.
We had a recent announcement over here vis-a-vis COVID, and Jim hat tip to you because Jim kind of went, I think this is probably an example of that. And then I kind of stormed in with, I think it's the entirety of the government's response to the COVID vis-a-vis what they've done for public health. I'm using a questioning inflection there.
Question and also quotation marks and all the brackets and all kinds of other things.
Underline and,
Italics, definitely.
Yeah. All of it.
And whatever that sarcasm thing is.
The little wiggly mouth that they use on Peanuts characters, all of that.
Yeah.
The kind of, wiggling your hand. Because on the 31st of October 2020, after the restrictions that had been imposed in March 2020 being relaxed somewhat by the summer, by the time the summer arrived, the number of COVID cases had risen so that by the 31st of October, and you can look all these stats up, there were 24,000 new cases, which were predicted to rise to 50,000 a day by the government's medical officers. So in this first clip, you'll hear Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty talk about that, and then we'll hear Boris's response.
And we now have around 50,000 new cases a day, and that is rising.
Look, I'm afraid no responsible Prime Minister can ignore the message of those figures. If we let the lines on those graphs grow, then the risk is that for the first time in our lives, the NHS will not be there for us because the virus is doubling faster than we can conceivably add capacity. The huge exponential growth in the number of patients, by no means all of them elderly, by the way, and the sheer weight of COVID demand would mean depriving tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of non-COVID patients of the care they need. And so now is the time to take action because there is no alternative.
We're focusing on the number of cases to justify the lockdown. So he's saying, there is no alternative. We've got to go back into lockdown because the numbers of cases are such that there will be an impact on what the NHS can handle. And the subtext is, the unspoken subtext is that the Tories have so decimated the NHS that they can't respond sufficiently quickly to up the capacity of doctors. You can't just shove some doctors in because there's it takes 7 years to train a doctor, and they've not been funding that for a decade. And they're restricting foreign doctors coming in. So, it's some catch-22.
I mean, so far I'm on board with...
Yeah.
There's lots of COVID.
Absolutely. But what's also interesting is that he is saying it's not just about the COVID, it's about, all these people that are going in. They're not just older people, but also it's about the impact on services that are non-COVID related. So you kind of go, fair enough. That's okay. Let's focus on the number. Great. We'll have that. We've been focusing on cases all the way along until the 5th of July, when there was an announcement. And this is where it becomes clear that the McNamara fallacy is being used, because exactly the same number of cases is happening. So here's what Boris is saying, but we're no longer looking at those cases. We're now looking at vaccines. Here what he says, spot the numbers at the beginning.
We're seeing cases rise fairly rapidly. There could be 50,000 cases detected per day by the 19th, and we're seeing rising hospital admissions. And we must reconcile ourselves, sadly, to more deaths from COVID. And there's only one reason why we can contemplate going ahead to step 4 in circumstances where we'd normally be locking down further, and that's because of the continuing effectiveness of the vaccine rollout, with over 45 million adults now having received a first dose and 33 million a second.
So the thing is, he's saying we've got exactly the same case as was going on in October, And we're going to have to reconcile ourselves, sadly, to more deaths. Why? Hello? Why do we need to reconcile ourselves? But he's saying, OK, but it's fine. We can do it because of the number of vaccine rollout. Because the rollout is such that these people, and you think, well, hang on a minute, that's not sufficient. What we need is a link between people having the vaccine and what benefit that's bringing. And so he goes on to say, OK, here's the impact that vaccines are having. So this is the number we're looking at.
Our vaccines have helped to break the link between disease and death. And as the days have gone by, it has grown ever clearer that these vaccines are indeed successful, with the majority of those admitted to hospital unvaccinated.
So the proof of its efficacy is that the people who've been hospitalised have been unvaccinated, right? Just hold that in your mind for the moment. So, you kind of think, OK, so we are now focusing on, in a McNamara-esque way, the number that's easy to measure, which is the number of deaths. And sure enough, on October 31st, there were 320 deaths. It peaked at 1,359 on January the 1st. On July the 2nd, which is the date for which there's the latest data, so ahead of the 5th, there are only 26. It's a little bit dodgy because the deaths are counted deaths within 28 days of a positive test, so they're like a month behind the numbers of cases.
As always, a lot of data that hasn't come in yet for those more recent numbers.
So the number of cases...
But it's we can agree it's way low,
way lower. Yeah. However, what they're conveniently ignoring is the number of cases strand. They've stopped measuring that, stopped counting that as the driver, and are now counting number of deaths. But that bit I asked you to remember, which is the people who are hospitalised are the unvaccinated people. So the number of deaths conveniently ignores that, because if the numbers because the problem still exists, because if the numbers are rising just as they did in October when there was no vaccine,
arguably faster because the Delta variant is much more aggressive and transmissible.
The Johnson variant, as Starmer nicely called it the other day. Quite. So those people in October were unvaccinated because there were no vaccines then. And the people with COVID who are hospitalised now are unvaccinated, just as they were in October. And the numbers are going up. Won't there still be... What you've got to look at is the number of cases versus the number of hospitalisations, surely, which is the metric they were using back in October to justify a lockdown. And I would say that the same metric is going to happen, because the people who are hospitalised, by his own admission, are the people who are unvaccinated. They're going to suffer just like the unvaccinated people did in October, and cause an impact on the NHS, blah, 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 blah. All of those reasons, which are now we're not worried about at all.
I'm going to offer some nuance, which is partly defensive of Johnson and partly excoriating of him. So
that's got a balanced journalistic approach. That's good. Yeah.
So first of all, I would say there is a much smaller reservoir of unvaccinated people now than there was before.
True. Yep. Because more people have been vaccinated.
So while absolutely. So while the cases can spread through the unvaccinated people, the likely impact on the NHS is much lower. The severity of the disease, thanks to the vaccine, certainly in vaccinated people, is much lower, and the likelihood of being hospitalised and so on is much lower. However, by focusing, even if they were focusing on cases, but I mean, he's not now. He's given up on that. But focusing on the countable things of cases, hospitalisations, and deaths, which is the three things they've been looking at the whole time, they are not looking at all at things like long COVID.
Yeah.
Things like long-term health effects from people who get the disease, but and maybe hospitalised, maybe not, but don't die from it. That is an impact on people's quality of life. It may potentially shorten people's lives. We don't know the long-term problems with it yet, but we do know that it is a thing that appears to damage some people's organs. But that's a lot harder that's the qualitative bit.
Yeah.
That's the bit that they're not measuring.
They're not measuring
really.
it, no, because
they're certainly not putting those numbers out there.
It's an inconvenient truth.
And that's the problem is with the cases increasing dramatically.
Yeah.
And this new variant, which is more aggressive, and it is spreading among unvaccinated people, that is going to lead to a lot more of those kinds of problems.
Yep.
And that is why I think that as horrible as lockdown is, and as many problems as it's caused, it's still necessary. Or measures, at least. But perhaps not complete lockdown, but being sensible.
Yeah. Part of the reason is actually there's been a change of personnel in the health department. More on that later. And Matt Hancock's been replaced by Sajid Javid, former Education and Home Secretary, and Sajid is famously resigned because Cummings fired his assistant. So he's kind of he's a danger to Boris, and he sees himself as a potential Prime Minister. Hancock never did, and I think Sajid is bullishly out to impress the senior Tories who are calling for an end to lockdown. Hancock was more cautious, and that's why I get the impression that Hancock was the kind of steadying hand, much as we hate the toady git. He was the steadying hand for this kind of bullish, let's just let the bodies pile up behaviour. And Sajid, in the eyes of senior Tories, is manoeuvring himself to be not Boris, and therefore to be more attractive to the kingmakers, who are kind of a bit disappointed in Boris and his namby-pamby looking after citizens, and his electorate.
Let the bodies pile up. Manoeuvre.
Exactly. Yeah.
Too much, at least.
But I'd like to remind you what Boris said, given all of those numbers in October ahead of lockdown 2. This is what he said.
Look, I'm afraid no responsible Prime Minister can ignore the message of those figures.
Which logically means that he's not a responsible Prime Minister.
Yeah, that's the only real answer that's possible.
We kind of knew that, but it's nice to have a watertight proof. And then here's finally a note that Boris made in the same October speech.
It's crucial to grasp this, that the general threat to public health comes not from focusing too much on COVID, but from not focusing enough, from failing to get it under control.
So there you have it. He is, by his own admission, a general threat to public health.
How many double negatives were in that?
I know, yeah. It comes not from focusing...
It comes not from focusing too much on COVID, but from not focusing enough from failing to get it under control.
Yeah.
What? That's the second time I've read it. Not a clue.
No. So he's not so it's a bit like Captain Hindsight. Actually, he is general threat. He calls Starmer Captain Hindsight, but he's actually general threat. And it's just, there is McNamara all over the bloody place. I see it now. You touch with no justification. Numbers used like long multiplication. Sociopathic lacking in motion. Logic completely failed you. There's 10,000 fallacies in the wild. We are the Rolling Stones there with 2,000 light years from home.
In the Fallacy in the Wild, we like to talk about the fallacy of the week from a non-political perspective. And our first example this week comes from John Oliver.
Yay.
In a segment on Last Week Tonight where he was dealing with standardised tests.
Many states now tie teacher pay to performance using one particular approach.
It's called value-added analysis, rating teachers based on student test scores. For instance, if a student who ranked in the 60th percentile test higher at the end of the year, the teacher gets a better rating. If the student falls, the teacher's rating falls.
OK, well, that explains why many teachers' classroom decorations that used to read, believe in yourself, now say, don't f f*ck me on this. Don't f*ck me. And while the idea of tying teacher pay to student improvement sounds great in theory, here's how it can work in practice.
I have 4 students whose predicted scores were literally impossible. One of my 6th grade students had a predicted score of 286.34. However, the highest a 6th grade student can earn is 283. The student did earn a 283, incidentally. Despite the fact she earned a perfect score, she counted negatively towards my evaluation.
Yeah.
And that is insane.
Yeah.
It's and that's the problem with focusing, and I mean it's an old thing of teaching to the test, but it's based on the fact that that's the only metric that is easy to measure.
Yeah.
When you look at generally how kids are doing, and you know if particular children are excelling, or if children from difficult backgrounds are managing to achieve less than the average but better for them, or something like that. It's you know, these things are really difficult to measure student by student. So they standardize it. They give you these value added scores which don't work for all cases. And Michael Rosen, the UK poet, former children's poet laureate, who writes a lot about children's education, did an article in The Guardian about testing and about targets for teachers and things like that. And he had a comment on his Guardian article from a teacher who said that they had been visited by people from the Department for Education. There's a small village school, and because it was a good school, they scored well. But she said to the Department for Education people that they wouldn't do as well this year because they had taken in 3 students who had been excluded from like multiple other schools. Right. And had problems at home. They'd had, all kinds of issues, but they were doing really well. They were responding to the teaching they were getting. They were engaged in the classroom and so on. Yeah. But it's their scores are going to bring the average down because they're not as good as some of the other students they've got. And the education department people were saying, well, you've kind of let the school down basically because your scores are going to be lower than they were last year. So that's not going to do as well for you.
When you can't,
they don't focus on the well-being of children. They focus on what are your scores, what scores can you get.
How do you measure that a school is a good school? I mean, in the UK we had Ofsted that measure how well schools perform, and they have a lot of measurements, but they seem to concentrate on how many students did they get to Cambridge, that kind of stuff.
But they focus. I mean, they do look at lots of different things, but they do it all in one or 2 days. Basically, they come to your school and have a look at what they can see. And yes, for schools which are really genuinely not achieving and don't know how to achieve, or can't pull it together in time for the Ofsted people to come, that does catch some problems. But what it tests in often better schools is their ability to show what they're doing rather than do the thing. And it doesn't, what they're often, one of the things the Ofsted people will test is, looking at the books and seeing how often they're marked. Which, I mean, that is, I think, quite unlikely to be the thing that makes a child love history.
Yes, exactly.
How often their history book is marked.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Because what they're doing in 3 days, they're going and inspect the school. They're going to do the things that are easy to measure in 3 days.
Exactly.
So you get a distorted view of the things that you need to be doing. So what they're doing is just teaching to the test, and it's the Ofsted.
Well, that's the thing. When you know what you're being measured on, that's the thing. You focus on the thing that's easily measured becomes the more important thing. In this part of this came out of George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind policy in 2002, and that increased the amount of testing that was happening in schools. One of the things that came from that, in New York at least, was that they were testing 4th grade and 8th grade reading levels and math levels. In New York, Mayor Bloomberg created a system where they had mandatory tests in the 3rd grade and the 7th grade, and students who failed those tests were held back.
Wow.
So if you weren't good enough at reading or math in 3rd or 7th grade, you didn't make it into 4th grade or 8th grade to take the national standardized tests.
So you only
which
got
meant
in there
all of the kids in the 4th grade and the 8th grade were
people that
the better performing ones.
Yeah.
And that is because he knew what was being measured.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you do that, you game the system. You don't focus on what's best for the children. You don't focus on, all of the important things that make a difference in children's educations. You focus on getting good marks on the things that they're testing you on. And you give them more importance than the important stuff, which is harder to measure.
Yep.
So our second example comes from The Muppet Christmas Carol, my second favourite Christmas film.
Yeah.
And
what's your first?
Die Hard, obviously.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah, right, yeah.
Excuse me, Mr. Scrooge, but it appears to be closing time.
Very well. I'll see you at 8 tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow's Christmas.
8:30 then.
If you please, sir. Half an hour off hardly seems customary for Christmas Day.
Hardly customary.
How much time off is customary, Mr. Cratchit?
The whole day.
Yeah, that's right, the whole day.
The entire day?
No, that's the frog's idea.
If you please, Mr. Scrooge, why open the office tomorrow? Other businesses will be closed. You'll have no one to do business with. It'll waste a lot of expensive coal for the fire.
Yes, that's definitely a
It's a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every December the 25th.
So, much like Trump, Scrooge only sees things in terms of money.
Yeah.
So the only way Bob Cratchit can convince him that his employees should have Christmas Day off is that it'll cost him.
Yeah.
It's not worth it financially for him to open up the office.
Because there's nobody else to do business with, and you'd just be using up coal to heat the place. Yeah.
Scrooge focuses, this is part of his problem, on something measurable. He focuses on the thing that, he can count how much money he has. He can count how much people owe on their mortgages and stuff like that. He absolutely ignores all of the qualitative stuff. He ignores all of the, the joy that people get from family and from Christmas and all of the other stuff that he later learns. Spoiler. In the film.
It's been 150 years. If you've not read it by now, far be it from us to spoil the joy of reading.
But after I thought of this example, I thought, basically it's just Trump, isn't it? It's Trump and Scrooge.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So our final example in this section is medicine in general,
right?
To some extent, But specifically, times when perhaps the thing that is measured isn't necessarily the best thing, but it's easy to measure. There was a 2012 paper by a doctor called Christopher Booth, who was looking at a thing that is common in looking at the outcomes of treating metastatic solid tumours, which is a thing called progression-free survival, or PFS.
Right.
And that's what they were measuring in trials for new drugs for dealing with these kinds of tumours. PFS is the length of time during and after the treatment of a disease that a patient lives with the disease, but it doesn't get worse. So what they're looking at is how long does my patient survive in cases where the cancer doesn't get worse, the tumour doesn't grow.
Right.
And that's what they were looking at and deciding whether these drugs were good or not. Things they weren't looking at, apart from something else which is pretty measurable, which is overall survival, was the quality of life.
Right.
They weren't looking at whether the tumour got smaller, or if the people's quality of life improved, they had less pain or more manoeuvrability or anything like that. The thing that they were very focused on, and this is in many different trials that were done for different drugs, was this PFS number, because it's an easy one to measure. It is you have a number of people, you can say, well, their cancer hasn't got worse, they are still alive at this point.
Yeah.
Therefore, this is our percentage. This is our number for this particular drug. And new treatments came out, and new drugs were approved based on this category. Those drugs may not have been better necessarily. They may not have had a more significant effect on the patients as other drugs, but they weren't measuring the kinds of things that I think as a patient you might be more interested in.
Yeah.
Is, how is my life going to change? How is it going to improve? Is it just going to, if it's shit at the moment, and all you're measuring is how long I can stay at this level of shit.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's not a great thing for me.
Yeah. Well, they wouldn't, but that wouldn't enter into their equation. It was just how long do you survive after having this?
Yeah.
It wouldn't measure that stuff. Yeah, kind of in that report, I recall there's another bit about the mortality rate in a hospital in Stafford, and I can remember hearing about that on the radio recently, and they were talking about, well, they were just measuring the wrong thing and giving a really bad report to this particular hospital, saying because there were high mortality rates, and actually it was because they were missing the fact that they were not measuring people who had gone through palliative. It was about the...
Yeah. One of the things in that study that they weren't looking at was avoidable deaths.
Yes, yeah.
They were looking at just total deaths.
Yeah. Yeah.
And different hospitals have different specialisms and have different kinds of patients that come to them, patients at different stages in their diseases, and they specialise in different things like that. So a hospital that treats people who are ultimately more likely to die isn't necessarily a worse hospital than a hospital that treats people at earlier stages of illness or things like that, or don't specialise in essentially terminal things, who have lower overall death rates. So it's measuring things like that. If you're not really, that's the problem. Basically, if you're choosing something to measure and you aren't doing it with a view to improving things overall, you're choosing the measurement thing because it's easy to measure. Then that's where the problem comes. If you're carefully looking at a situation and thinking, okay, what are things that I can measure here that if I can improve them will actually have an overall benefit, that's okay. That's not a problem.
So we're gonna play fake news, folks. I love the game. It's a great game.
I understand the game as well as anybody.
Yes, it's time for fake news, the game where I read out 3 Trump quotes, 2 of which are real and 1 I made up, and Mark has to figure out which one is fake news.
Yeah. Well, I think actually the important thing to focus on here is just the number of times that I've got it right. That's the way we should measure it. That's the true measure of performance. Forget about how many times we've played this, but let's just look at how many times I've won it. And
I mean, both are reasonably easy to measure, so that's fine. Yeah, what we're not measuring is how badly wrong you get it sometimes.
No, true.
Where you're like, I'm pretty sure that's right, and it's
like woefully out. Yeah, so, I mean, I think it's a given that when I get it wrong, it's spectacularly wrong. Not only do I choose it, but that kind of comes down to, I guess the opposing measure is how good you are at it. That's
pretty tricky to measure that.
Yeah, well, not really, because I just count how many times I didn't get it. I just go 36 times.
36, yeah.
You've got it. Well, you've outsmarted me. Yeah,
these ones are from basically Trump has decided to sue big tech. Social media, because he's butthurt that he can't post on Facebook and Twitter anymore.
Right.
So he's decided to sue them and claim that they need to follow the First Amendment rules, like as if they were the government.
Okay.
Right. And he's found a bunch of lawyers who are prepared to actually do this.
Right. Because he's
most
paying
of whom
the
are
money.
Personally, well, he probably isn't.
No.
Let's face it.
Let's face it.
But they're like, just. I think there's a real estate lawyer and a personal injury lawyer and people like that. They're not
they're not.
Like they're not Sidney Powell. Let's even put it like that.
Put it like that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not even Rudy Giuliani. Yeah.
No,
Let's
they're
put
not.
it that
Jesus,
way.
they're not up to Trump's usual standard of.
Oh my God! Yeah.
And consequently, this is going absolutely nowhere, of course. But he's already fundraising off the back of it, so there's that.
Yeah.
But this was from a press conference that he held, announcing his lawsuit against Twitter and Facebook and the others.
Right.
And it was batshit as usual.
Mm-hmm.
So these are some things he said.
Okay.
Number 1. But we are the majority side by a lot. I believe we're the majority side by far more than anybody would understand. You just have to take a look at what happened in recent elections and add up the right numbers. You will see a majority like you wouldn't believe, because nobody can believe what some of the things that are being said are. Nobody believes that.
Right. Okay. You wouldn't believe because nobody can believe. You wouldn't believe it because nobody can believe what some of the things that are being said are. That is brilliant. That's something that Elmo would say. Okay. Right.
Number 2.
Right. Yeah.
Then it was finally revealed that this was most likely the truth, that it came from the lab, and it was a small little story, but when I said it, it was like a weapon went off, a major weapon. I won't use the word weapon, because I never used the word nuclear, but we have to be careful with our leadership, because if we don't have a proper leadership, we're in a very perilous state. So we don't use the word nuclear. I never use it, okay? Never use it. I never said it. That's called disinformation.
Whoa. Okay. That's an amazing bunch of non sequiturs. That's fantastic. Right.
And number 3.
How do you get from most likely true to nuclear? Okay. Right. Yeah.
Number 3. And you've got doctors, great doctors, and other medical people getting banned from Twitter and Facebook, or even shadow banned. They call it shadow banning. That's when they let you post, but your posts are, nobody can see your posts. And these nurses and doctors, they got banned for talking about a thing we used to hear a lot about, a thing called hydroxychloroquine. And all of the most recent tests show very strongly that that works.
Okay. Right then, I really want number 1 to be true, just because I want to hear that sentence. You wouldn't believe because nobody can believe what some of the things that are being said are. What some of the things that are being said are. That's brilliant. I used to know. I knew a guy when I was working in a theatre group who would say, "The thing of it is," and that's what that reminds me of. Okay, and then the thing about the escalation from truth through to leadership and nuclear. Okay,
It's number 2, by the way. He's talking about COVID. I don't know if that was clear.
Okay. Oh yeah. That makes that a lot clearer. Yeah. Oh yeah, the lab thing. Right. Okay. Okay. What do you know about shadow banning? Okay. I think then that number 3 is the one you made up. The doctors, great doctors, other medical people. I think.
Okay.
That. Yeah.
So out of the other 2,
Yeah.
which are you more convinced by?
I'm more convinced by nobody can believe what some of the things that are being said are. Number 1, I think. I hope, because I just want to hear him say it. And if he doesn't say it, I would need you to say it in his voice.
Well, number 1 is real.
Oh, my God.
But we are the majority side by a lot. I believe we are the majority side by far more than anybody would understand. You just have to take a look at what happened in recent elections and add up the right numbers. You will see a majority like you wouldn't believe, because nobody can believe what some of the things that are being said are. Nobody believes that.
What the fuck did he say?
Not sure.
That's brilliant, isn't it?
Yeah.
It just kind of it goes from we are the majority side to I believe with the majority side, so that it's kind of that's reverse accelerated truth. Because he kind of got
more than anybody would understand. I mean, I know we did a whole episode about hyperbole.
Yeah.
But what is a number that literally nobody could
understand it
understand
because it's so
out of 100%.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to his elections, you just have to look at what happened and add up the right numbers. You've a majority because nobody. It's a majority like you wouldn't believe
things
because nobody can believe what some of the things that are being. Even he paused and kind of went, where have I gone?
Yeah, he was like, I've got no idea what I'm saying.
Got there?
But he just kept going,
and nobody believes that. It's just what, and people are.
There was no context here that I could have added.
Yeah. And I hope there's nobody in the audience and if there are, they're just looking at each other going, what the fuck did he just say? Yeah. And they all put their hands up like kids in an assembly. They just go, put their hands up because they've got questions. And go, what did you just say? I don't understand. So say that again. Whoa. Okay. So, well, that was great. I liked him saying that. Yeah.
You also think that number 2, where he claims never to have said the word nuclear, is true.
I think because he would definitely deny that because he has. Yeah.
And number 2 is real.
Oh my God!
Then it was finally revealed that this was most likely the truth, that it came from the lab, and it was a small little story. But when I said it, it was like a weapon went off, a major weapon. I won't use the word weapon because I never use the word nuclear, but we have to be careful with our leadership because if we don't have the proper leadership, we're in a very perilous state. So we don't use the word nuclear. I never use it, okay? Never use it. I never said it. That's called disinformation.
Brilliant. I didn't know that. Remember the stand-up comic that did Trump speeches as though he were drunk. It was, the woman comic. That's just she's got to do that one.
Sarah Cooper.
Yeah, it is that. He just
I don't know what the fuck he's talking about.
But
I know what he's talking about with the first thing.
Yeah,
because he has been saying that it's now been proved what he was claiming, that it came from the lab in Wuhan.
Yeah.
Which it absolutely has not.
Yeah.
And also is very disingenuous in that one of the things that lots of people, idiots, were saying in the beginning of the whole problem was that it was deliberately manufactured and released by the lab in Wuhan.
Yeah.
That was the lab leak theory as of January 2020 or February 2020.
Yeah.
And that was what he has been pushing occasionally when he's remembered to.
Yeah.
That it was China did it.
Yeah.
It's all their fault.
China. Yeah.
At the time, what everyone was saying, all the non-idiots were saying, was no, that's not true. At no point did anyone say it definitely didn't come from the lab.
Yeah,
there were various theories on where it might have come from, and they were never really able to track it down. What they did say was that all of the things that you need to have an outbreak, a zoonotic outbreak where something crosses from animals to humans, were in place in the Wuhan area.
Yeah.
No, not in the lab, but in the area. Where they thought maybe it came from a wet market at one point. Maybe there were animals which they knew had this, bats which they knew had this disease. Other animals potentially. It started obviously in this area. They knew that there were people in the same vicinity as the animals and things like that. All of the things that they needed, and from in the first few months, all of the kind of DNA testing and the modelling that they were doing was showing what at first they thought, well, maybe it's, it could potentially kind of look man-made if you look at it from a certain angle. They went, oh no, okay, we've seen basically every element of this disease we've seen before in other stuff.
Yeah.
We just haven't seen this one before. Yeah. But we've seen all of the parts. We know it's absolutely likely that it occurred just in nature and mutated and then crossed over to humans. That's not to say that it's not possible that the outbreak started in the lab or came from the lab, because that lab was dealing with this virus because they are in the area where the bats have that virus. And they study bat viruses. However, everyone who knows anything about the lab has been saying it's incredibly unlikely. There was an Australian scientist who worked at the lab who just came out this week or last week, who said, look, it's basically, you know, you have to, when you leave the lab, you have to have a chemical shower and then a personal shower. You know, there are so many safeguards, things going in, things coming out. It's just incredibly unlikely. It's not impossible, because someone could have accidentally got infected and then they could have infected other people. But it's incredibly unlikely. Even she isn't saying it's definitely not true. But what the scientific community as a whole has said is, we haven't been able to find how it started. We thought by now, and similar to our last episode, you know, if we were going to find it by now, we'd have found it by now. They thought by now they would have figured out where it happened and exactly what happened, but they haven't, which lends slightly more credence to the possibility that it started in the lab.
Right.
Because they haven't found it in the wild in exactly the ways that they expected. But that is very, very different from saying it's most likely the lab. And completely different from saying it was deliberately released by the lab, which was what the original lab theory was.
In good news, other news, the anti-vaxxer in my life was reporting to me that several of her people of her acquaintance were talking about the lab theory. And she was going, oh, my God, they're really going on about it. Jesus Christ, look at this. And then they've mentioned the Illuminati and the Cabal. And I'm going, aha, you have learned well, Grasshopper. So she's sending stuff back. And actually, she said, of course, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. I went, oh, my God, that's, so things are looking up.
Excellent. So number 3 is, as you suspected, fake news. He did talk about this kind of thing. He talked about doctors being banned for pushing hydroxychloroquine, and he did claim that the recent studies all show that it works, basically, which again is a complete lie.
Right.
The most recent thing I could find was a meta-analysis that was done in April of this year, which says it's a collaborative meta-analysis of 28 published or unpublished randomized controlled trials, including 10,319 patients.
Right.
It showed that treatment with hydroxychloroquine was associated with increased mortality in COVID-19 patients.
So quite the opposite.
Result. Exactly the opposite of what Trump says.
What Trump is wanting to be true. Oh wow! And all under the notion of suing big tech.
Yeah, ultimately, this is kind of part of his lawsuit, is saying, you know, you shouldn't be censoring doctors for giving health information. To which the big tech lawyers will rightfully say, it's wrong health information, which is going to get people killed. Yes, we should be doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, which means I've won.
Which means you won.
Yes. Oh, I forgot about that. I'm so in broad enjoying the fact that he would say, can't believe what some of the things that are being said are. But yay! You see, it all comes down to, if you just focus on the positive numbers, then it can change the whole thing, change the game.
There you go.
Brilliant. Yay.
So it's time for the part of the show that this week at least is called Indictments Are Not a Logical Fallacy, because the Manhattan District Attorney's Office have charged the Trump Organization and Alan Weisselberg, the CFO for the Trump Organization, with various felonies. Which is awesome, and probably just the beginning of other indictments and other charges that they will be bringing.
Various long-standing
Yeah.
Yeah.
They allege in the indictment a 15-year-long criminal scheme of systematic fraud, which includes basically benefits to just Weisselberg himself in the amount of over $1.7 million.
Yeah. So it's basically all that stuff about the Al Capone idea that actually will get this guy who's he's responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and crimes against humanity, which is going to get him on tax evasion.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, yes, you're thinking, oh, that's why he didn't release his tax records through the entirety of his presidential term.
Yeah, although they did keep quite extensive records of the things that they paid Weisselberg kind of off the books.
That's always that weird thing, isn't it? Why would you keep careful account of the paying off your accountant to hide how much you've got in your account? Why does that happen? You do that stuff. Have you not watched any gangster movies?
We've said it before, but the thing about Trump is not just that he's a criminal, but he's such a bad criminal.
Really
he's so bad at the crime. It's so weird.
Yeah.
You would think if you were a billionaire, if you were running, this huge company, and you could hire as many criminal people as you want, basically.
Yeah.
You would think some of them would know how to do it in a way which wasn't so obvious as soon as someone starts looking at their books or looking into it at all. You'd think that criminals by now would have found a way to hide it better.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing, isn't it? Because they're all just chances and chumps that have happened upon it. I mean, look at Rudy, for heaven's sake. That they've just happened upon. They've fallen into good times. They are a bit like Biff Tannen. He's not the sharpest tool in the box. He kind of go, oh yeah, this is great. I've happened upon this thing. I had one good idea, which was to steal the thing and take it back. Give it to the younger. Go back in time and give it to the younger guy. And that's it. That was it. Everything else just rubbish. And Trump hasn't even had one good idea, apart from let's defraud everybody in a systematic way.
There's another thing that keeps coming back, which is multiple times when something bad happened when Trump was actually president. His staff members would give a version of events. And then he would say, that's not what happened. Here's what really happened, and make it much, much worse.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what's happening here again, because Weisselberg has pled not guilty.
Right.
And it looks like he isn't cooperating at the moment.
Right.
But basically every member of the Trump family has spent the last week since this came out going, yeah, we totally did that. What are you going to do about it? Because they're not currently under indictment.
In order to kind of distance themselves from him, they're kind of going, oh, yeah, no, actually, yeah, we did do that. He's lying. If he's not telling you the things that we did do, I'll tell you that we did. And they're in a kind of misguided attempt to shift more blame onto him.
Yeah.
So they're kind of going,
even that, because they're not saying, oh, yes, we saw Weisselberg do this.
Yeah.
There's, a couple of the things that have been alleged by District Attorney Cy Vance is they paid for Weisselberg's grandchildren to go to a private school, $360,000 of off-the-books money in private tuition for Weisselberg family members, and a $200,000 Mercedes for Weisselberg and his wife.
Right.
And these were off the books. They, weren't expensed properly, so they didn't pay taxes on this stuff.
Yeah.
Don Jr. went on TV.
Would just disappear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don Jr. went on TV and said, my dad paid for his Weisselberg's grandkids' private school. He's a nice guy. He does these things for his employees.
He looks after his employees.
My dad did that, he said.
Yeah, he's
that's
a great guy.
Admission.
There you go. That's and it's videotaped in front of, several hundred people, depending on which channel it's on. Obviously not GB News, but wow, part of this kind of aggrandizement gene that the Trumps have, that they've got to say, yeah, we're really good at being bad. Let me tell you how good we are.
Yeah.
Because they can't stand that people don't know how marvelously evil they are.
Yeah, it's basically saying you're goddamn right. I ordered the code red.
Yeah,
and Trump stood up in front of a rally in Florida the other week and said, "Oh, they're talking about silly things like whether I get paid for him to have a car."
Yeah.
And then that it's not on the tax forms, and who here knows? Do you even need to put that on the forms and stuff like that? And this is the guy who, like 4 years ago, was saying, "I know tax law better than any human ever."
Yeah.
And that is not me being hyperbolic. That is what he said.
He actually said, yeah. Yeah.
And now he's just like going, who can remember to put every little Mercedes that they pay for their staff members on their tax forms?
And the audience go, yeah, you're right, stick it to the man. Ignoring the fact that he is the man. He's in charge of the men. And the men that do the tax stuff means that your kids get free education. And...
and basically everyone in our audience is paying all their taxes, or the IRS is coming after them, putting them in prison.
Yeah, exactly. And meanwhile, he's going, who knew you had to put $200,000 worth of Mercedes for your chief embezzler on your tax form?
Meanwhile, Eric Trump is not worried that he is going to be indicted.
Oh, okay.
Because he says that he there is that, because that's how Don Jr. got away with collaborating with the Russians. Being too stupid to understand what law he was going on.
Yeah,
but he says that they're not in danger of being indicted because Don and Ivanka lead incredibly clean lives. And he also invoked our last fallacy and said if they were going to indict us, they would have done
it already. Yay!
If they had enough, basically, he said if they had enough to
they would have got us
to prosecute them, they would have they would have done it already. Which is again, as we said last time, not how this works.
Not how it works. No,
because Weisselberg could absolutely give them more information, and Weisselberg's daughter-in-law, as we said on a previous episode, is absolutely cooperating.
Yeah.
Because she hasn't done anything wrong.
No. So she's going, this happened, that happened. Yeah. So
she's cooperating with the media and the prosecutors and
so
everyone.
At the very least, she's collaborating or corroborating, rather. She's corroborating evidence that they've already
She has
got.
the receipts, literally.
Yeah. Yeah. They go, I've got all these bits of paper with dates and amounts and names on. Are they any use? Yeah. Madness.
So, watch this space, and we shall find out who will be next. Maybe we need to start an indictment pool.
Hey, good idea. Yeah, let's do that. And finally, some things we really don't have time to talk about.
We recorded our last episode a bit earlier in the week than usual, and by the time we released it, all the news happened.
Everything.
The DOJ sued Georgia, Giuliani's law licence got suspended, and right-wing British news channel GB News lost so many viewers after their first week that their top-rated programme was beaten in the ratings by the Welsh language version of Paw Patrol. One of the other newses we missed was the sentencing of Derek Chauvin, who got 22.5 years for murdering George Floyd, which was simultaneously surprisingly long and nowhere near enough. Following the sentencing, QAnon supporters took a short break from insisting JFK Jr. is about to show up any minute at a Trump rally to claim that Chauvin isn't Chauvin. Who the fuck is that? That's not the same guy from the trial, tweeted one of the fucking nutjobs, while another mental case posted, this Chauvin looks nothing like the original, on Telegram. It seems that QAnoners, who are absolutely convinced they can interpret the inner workings of the top-secret deep state based on the cryptic breadcrumbs left by a shadowy intelligence operative, are utterly fucking bamboozled by a man having a haircut.
Excellent. Philosophically, he's still the same person. Yeah. Early on in the phenomenon of crowdfunding, I signed up for a project the musician Neil Young was hawking around as an alternative high-definition digital pocket music player. Having convinced various established and new musicians that the MP3 format had solved them down the audio river, he promised endorsed versions of these so-called Pono players to those who gave enough. As an audiophile, it was an attractive idea, if a bit niche. He gathered enough cash, shipped the players, the format wars moved on, Phones replaced separate MP3 players, and the project was shelved 3 years later. This seemed to be about par for the course, time-wise, for various other things that have caught my eye, if not my cash. Up-to-date 2021 news, though. Niche clientele suspended lawyer Rudy Giuliani hopped on the bandwagon and threw himself on the largesse of public opinion to crowdfund his legal defence expenses. If anything is going to tell you how relevant you continue to be, it's not just that music companies don't adopt your format ideas, but rather that your crowdfunder closes at 0.1% of your target. Rudy's dreams of capitalising on the love of the people to raise the $5 million he needs ended when he was rudely awakened to the fact that no one loves him enough to actually give him of their pockets as well as their hearts. To date, the closing date, today, Rudy knows for sure that 92 people actually love him, but yeah, not so much, only to the tune of $9,600. That's gotta hurt, hey?
On the last episode, I chose not to cover a story about Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman who looks like if there was a bigger, uglier Wayans brother who starred in the movie White Chicks instead of Marlon. Anyway, MTG, who has previously said awful things about the Holocaust, went to the Holocaust Museum, was shown around by someone who managed to convince her it was a bad thing, and then made a public apology about the things she'd said. I didn't cover it because, while it's fucking ridiculous that a 47-year-old woman is just learning the Holocaust was bad, I didn't want to mock the idea of learning and personal growth, no matter how small and probably disingenuous. But fuck that, because she's at it again. 3 weeks after her faux contrite, almost certainly Kevin McCarthy mandated apology in which she said there was nothing comparable to what the Nazis did, she compared Biden's proposed door-to-door vaccination programme to medical brown shirts forcing people to be part of a human experiment.
Similarly incapable of articulating disapproval of the Proud Boys and, let's face it, simply grasped the notion that Nazis were bad, Trump is reported in the new book by Michael Bender called Frankly, We Did Win This Election, as having said to his then Chief of Staff John Kelly, well, Hitler did a lot of good things. This, of course, is in the historically satirical tradition of saying, well, at least Mussolini got the trains to run on time and Attila the Hun was kind to his horses. Except, as Kelly discovered in trying to convince Trump that even if they did have nice, smart uniforms, you cannot ever say anything supportive of Adolf Hitler. You just can't. Trump had a total disregard for the history of any race, religion or creed. Apart from being a bit shocking, it's no surprise really, as Donny sees it, if it's not about Trump, then it's not worth a fuck. Shamed and humbled by the revelations in the new book, Trump's representatives issued an immediate apology, calling it made-up fake news put about by a disgruntled former general or somebody that got fired. Well, 2 out of 3 is not bad, I suppose.
The same book also alleges that Trump knew how to deal with the BLM protests that followed the murder of George Floyd, but was prevented from doing so by members of his administration. Which is pretty lucky, since Trump's solution was to beat the fuck out of the protesters, just shoot them. When his staff pointed out how fucking crazy that was, he said, well, shoot them in the leg, or maybe the foot. Holy shit.
You must respect my authority. Oh, God's sake. OK, let's play a game. We're going to set up a new online hub to challenge the woke tyranny of big tech because we're fed up with them scraping all our personal details and selling them to sinister beings on the dark web. We'll need properly encrypted do-dabbers and shiz like that. Oh, and you've got to play the role of a fuming, gammon-faced right-winger whilst doing so. OK, go. And the winner is long-time Trump apologist Jason Miller, who's set up Getter, Gettr. Yeah, me neither. Tinder, Grindr, Getter. Anyway, apparently Getter, I quote, is the marketplace of ideas. We will not cancel people for their political opinions, and Getter offers far more features and better technology than anything else out there. Yeah.
I can't believe that's what they went with for their description.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, because it doesn't. Launched on 4th of July, immediately hacked in like 20 minutes by @Juba Baghdad, who replaced the details of top account holders Mike Pompeo, America's Conservative Union Chairman Matt Schlapp, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, and even Jason Miller himself, scraping their login details, email, date of birth and other personal information through a glaring hole he pointed out in their API server to them at Getter. They weren't interested. One would be remiss not to mention the extraordinary amount of furry porn involving Sonic the Hedgehog that has also flooded Getter. Salon, the online newspaper, has verified that the Getter site is now attempting to ban accounts posting Sonic porn, which has provoked protests from left-wing trolls eager to argue that Miller's team is violating their own mission statement of free expression, all of which has done nothing to impress Trump. Apparently he's not interested in signing up, probably because he's got that small orange mammal constantly humping his bald head already.
Kevin McCarthy has drawn a line in the sand and announced that there are some things you can do as a Republican member of Congress that simply cannot stand and will result in the loss of your committee assignments. No, it's not helping to incite an insurrection like Mo Brooks, or fundraising alongside Holocaust-denying white supremacists like Paul Gosar, or sex-trafficking minors like Matt Gaetz, or constantly comparing life-saving measures to Nazi Germany like Marjorie Taylor Greene, or speaking at QAnon rally like Louis Gohmert, or covering up sexual abuse like Jim Jordan, or, I could go on, but no. The thing that will result in the loss of your committee assignments is accepting an invitation from Nancy Pelosi to sit on a bipartisan select committee to investigate the January 6th insurrection. It's weird. Despite claiming that it either wasn't that bad, or was Antifa, or was FBI agents leading the whole thing, or was just a normal tourist visit, the GOP seem really, really keen to never ever find out the truth.
Only that. Yeah. Well, a lot has happened in sainted Albion since we last spoke, and then again, not much. Former Health Secretary, oh yes, and sex policeman, Matt Hancock, sex policeman, yes, remember when he got enraged at government advisor Professor Neil Ferguson for breaking lockdown rules to visit his mistress and call for his resignation in March 2020. And former Health Secretary, yes indeed, Mr. Hat Mancock only got filmed snogging his girlfriend, who he'd appointed as an advisor at £1,000 a day, in the corridor outside his office, slap bang in the middle of the latest lockdown, where the rules included no getting anywhere close to anyone outside your immediate family. He, of course, apologised. Boris, of course, accepted his apology and called the matter closed. The entire world, including the tabloid press, but only because there was snogging involved, got enraged, and for once the press held him to account. The news cycle didn't wheel past, and Hancock resigned. Boris appointed Sajid Javid the next day. After all, much better to have your enemies inside the tent pissing out than outside pissing in. And then set about rewriting history, implying that he, Boris, was the one that made Matt leave. And when everyone in the world and the press pointed out that he'd called the matter closed, he simply repeated, "We had a new man in post the next day." Well, yeah, and how has nothing changed? Well, the record goes round again. Unlocking too early, cases will rise, there will be U-turns, and we'll lock down again. Or will we? Because Boris will do whatever's popular. Fuck you and the consequences, and that's official. Currently, he's claiming England's soccer squad's victories in the European Cup and the youngest British player to reach the fourth round of Wimbledon ever as his own, despite his immigration policies meaning that the squad would consist of only 3 players and Emily Raducanu would have to finish her A-levels in an offshore detention vessel. Despite his 2020 fortitude and bulldog grit to do everything in his power to send the virus packing, he's telling us now that we have to live with it, as he can't be asked any longer, because people are associating him with bad things, like no holidays, not being able to see Gran, and death, and stuff like that. If there is a reductio ad Churchillium fallacy, well, this is it. It's like Winston throwing in the towel and surrendering by Christmas 1939, because the people who voted for him might not do so again, as they're a bit fed up with blackouts and rationing and the Blitz and Nazis and stuff. Churchill was right, of course. They didn't vote him back in, and thus the post-war socialist health, housing and education policies that the Tories have been destroying ever since were born. Plus ça change, plus la même chose.
£1,000 a day is not enough to be kissing Matt Hancock.
No. And I think part of the shock that was felt by the British public was, Jesus Christ, he's had sex with 2 women.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel sorry for his wife, just because she's, married to Matt Hancock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's got children that probably look like him.
Oh, that's really unfortunate, yeah. Oh, I hadn't even thought about that. That's terrible.
And her name's on the birth certificate. I know. Yeah.
So that's all the bad arguments and faulty reasoning we have time for this week. You'll find the show notes at fallacioustrump.com, and if you hear Trump say something stupid and want to ask if it's a fallacy, our contact details are on the contact page.
If you think we've used a fallacy ourselves, let us know. If you've had a good time, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the show at patreon.com/ftrump. Just like our strawman level patrons Max Beaver, Kaz Tui, Steve Bickle, Schmutz, Mark Reike, and Amber R. Buchanan, and our top true Scotsman level patron Lauren. Thank you so much, everyone. We really do appreciate your support.
You can connect with those awesome people as well as us and other listeners in the Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/FallaciousTrump.
All music is by The Outbursts and was used with permission. So until next time on Fallacious Trump, we'll leave the last word to the Donald.
That's right. Go home to mommy. Bye. Bye.
So it's part of the show. It's the why am I stumbling over this? It's 78 episodes in. What the fuck? Oh, Jesus Christ.